All right. How's everybody doing? Getting a few minutes for folks to join. Welcome, everybody. We're about to get started in a second. Hello, everybody. I'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Appreciate you being here. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this quick conversation we were going to have about the trial of Daniel Penny, who has been charged with manslaughter for killing Jordan Neely on a subway in New York City. As a reminder, the case is still ongoing, and what we're going to be talking about today are a few things. One, will kind of give you a little bit of insight into what the jurors are being tasked with doing in this particular case. We'll provide some more factual backdrop in terms of what has been presented as what has occurred in this particular trial, in this particular matter, and then see what thoughts and questions you have. First, I want to acknowledge that somebody has died, somebody has been killed, and this person, described as Jordan Neely, is known to be a performer on our subways in New York. And I'm going to bring in one of our experts, Ms. Portia Venable, New York, to join me in this conversation about this particular case. So give me 1 second while I bring her in. Look at that. What's going on, Portia?
Hey,
How you doing?
holding steady, holding
Yeah.
steady.
For those of us that are on the live, please join me in wishing Portia a happy birthday. She celebrated a birthday.
Thank you, thank
She's
you.
joining us with the high C's on her to hate it. So this is a
Absolutely.
treat to have you joining us. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation, because you have so much expertise that I'm excited to kind of share with our audience and give folks some additional perspectives about this particular case. And so as I was sharing with folks, we're going to have a conversation about what has taken place relating to this trial of Daniel Penny for killing Jordan Neely. And this happened on a subway in New York. And there's no question about who killed Jordan Neely. There's no question, because this was all captured on tape. And unfortunately, but also fortunately, so many deaths of Black people have been captured on tape, and it's very difficult to watch. But it is very powerful to have a unbiased recount and representation of what actually took place, because sometimes there can be disagreement as to the factual backdrop of what has actually occurred. Um, so we do have a tape. I'm not encouraging anybody to watch the tape, but just know that there is that source of reference in terms of what actually took place, because it did happen. It was recorded by a young person in New York City, and that recording helps us kind of really get an understanding of what was going on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual charges, and then I'm going to ask Portia just to kind of give us a brief kind of factual backdrop of what our understanding is of what took place. So Daniel Penny is charged with manslaughter, and manslaughter is a form of homicide. And in New York, it is a death that has resulted at the form of recklessness. Now, in New York, the top charge is manslaughter. And if the jury, for some reason, disagrees or cannot come to a verdict on manslaughter, then the next charge that they would be considering is negligent homicide. And that's actually where we are right now. Yesterday, the jury came back with two different notes to the judge saying, listen, we can't reach a unanimous verdict, meaning all 12 jurors were unable to agree on what the verdict was going to be. And that happened twice. And so the prosecutors decided to dismiss the charge of manslaughter. So now the only charge that Daniel Penny is being he has against him is a charge of negligent homicide. So that's what we'll be discussing in terms of what the jury will be considering. But before we get into that, I want to ask Portia if she can just kind of give a very brief summary of what is alleged to have taken place.
Sure. So, as the F train was proceeding on its route, Jordan Neely stuck his body into the train doors as they were closing. When he got onto the train, he almost immediately started acting what witnesses call or frame as erratic and disruptive. And one of the things that he said, or a few of the things that he said, is that I am thirsty, I am hungry, right? And uh, many people talk about the fact that he was threatening folks. There is no witness account. I urge our viewers to read the transcripts, read witness accounts. There is not one person who was on that train that said that Jordan Neely threatened them. In fact, Daniel Penny is the only person who told police that Jordan Neely basically said, I'll kill you, which is something that he said in the air. No passenger on the train stated that Jordan Neely said anything directly to them. And almost immediately, Daniel Penny put Jordan Neely into a headlock, rather chokehold. Headlock is minimizing what he experienced. Put him into a chokehold. Um, Maybe a stop or so later, Eric Gonzalez gets on the train. When Eric Gonzalez gets on the train, and this is vital to note, Daniel Penny already had Jordan Neely in the headlock. Eric Gonzalez held Jordan Neely's arms down. At some point, I believe the next stop, passengers exited the train, and once Jordan Neely went limp, Eric Gonzalez released his hands, and Daniel Penny released his neck, and that's when police got onto the train. I think it's important to note that Eric Gonzalez originally left the train. And it wasn't until he was identified later that he ultimately explained to the police what happened. His first story was a lie, which was that Jordan Neely threatened him. And that is why he felt compelled to join Daniel Penny in killing Jordan Neely.
Thanks for that backdrop. And so I just want to recap the three different people that we've talked about. So one is Daniel Penny, and Daniel Penny is the person who's been charged with the killing of Jordan Neely. Jordan
Correct.
Neely is the person who has been killed, and Jordan Neely has been described as an amazing Michael Jackson impersonator. If you've ever been in New York or if you live in New York, you're very familiar with the work of providing entertainment on the subway. And then the third,
For a fee.
I'm sorry,
For a fee.
for a fee, of course, yeah, not for free. Um, and then Eric Gonzalez, who is somebody who was assisting Daniel Penny in holding Jordan Neely down. I used to live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and I used to catch the A train all the time. And some of the best entertainment I've ever seen in my life has been on that A train or any of the trains. So the notion that Jordan Neely, was a expert and kind of master impersonator of Michael Jackson, is an important reference point because I've seen the media only describing him as a homeless man or a person experiencing houselessness. And I just have to name that because I want to be careful with how we're putting particular labels on people because sometimes that minimizes who they are. And if we can minimize who they are, then perhaps their death isn't scrutinized in the same way that we would scrutinize perhaps the killing of other people. So we have these three individuals: Jordan Neely, who has been killed.
Actually, four.
Four. Who's
There's actually four. One person that I left out, who ultimately did not testify at trial, was a tourist. If folks watch the body worn camera footage, um, they will see that there were actually four individuals. There was Daniel Penny, who performed the chokehold that killed Jordan Neely, Eric Gonzalez, who held his arms down, and a tourist who actually didn't testify, who also assisted in holding Jordan Neely down.
okay? Thanks for that clarification. Um, so we have this only charge that has lasted, which is a charge of criminal negligent homicide. And before we have gotten there, and the jury was still considering manslaughter, the judge provided what is described as an Allen charge to the jury. Can you explain to us what an Allen charge is?
Sure. You know, proponents of the criminal legal system enjoy talking about this concept of finality and how finality is what provides justice to both individuals that have been harmed and the accused, right? And so when a person exercises their right to go to trial, the expectation is that the trial will end and the jury will reach a verdict, whether it be guilty or not guilty, and the case will be over no matter how it ends up, right? And there are times when you have 12 people in a room, oftentimes they can't agree, right? You and I talked yesterday about how difficult it is for 12 strangers to agree on things, right? Anything. I gave the example that I did during a training once. And I told every single person in a room just to illustrate this concept of how difficult it is for 12 people to reach a verdict. And I said to the people who were at my training, right? I will buy dinner. I will pay for everything. I will pay for appetizers. I will pay for drinks. I will pay for entrees. I will pay for desserts. I will pay for everything. The only thing that you are required to do is agree on everything. Everyone must agree on the drink, must agree on the appetizer, must agree on the entree, must agree on the dessert. And even with me, offering to pay, folks still couldn't
Mm,
agree. And, that is a sort of kind of offshot version of what folks are required to do when they're on a jury, right? Which is decide guilt or innocence. And people take that burden incredibly seriously or take that job incredibly serious. And so, the 12 individuals went to the back and they simply could not agree on the top count, which is manslaughter. There were some folks who wanted to convict Daniel Penny, and there were some folks who wanted to acquit Daniel Penny, and they could not come up with a unanimous verdict. The folks who wanted to acquit held firm, the folks who wanted to convict held firm.
mm,
And so as a result, the foreperson, who is the first person on the jury, sent a note to the judge explaining that the jurors could not reach a verdict.
mm.
That judge said to the jurors, you have to go back and try. And that stems from the case People v. Allen, where the case talks about
Right.
finality and how important finality is in the criminal legal system. And in a trial, finality is a unanimous
Yeah.
verdict. And so an Allen charge is simply a judge stating, folks, I need y'all to go back and I need y'all to try again.
hmm So they tried, and they were unable to come back with a verdict for the manslaughter charge, and so now we're considering criminally negligent homicide. Um, what signal, or how do you think it's being received that the prosecution has dismissed this manslaughter charge? Have you seen any news regarding reactions from the family of Jordan Neely about that decision?
So it's so not so just to be clear, Jordan Neely's uncle has been in front of the Manhattan courthouse protesting with Hawk Newsome, his sister Siobhan Newsome, and other members of Black Lives Matter of Greater New York. And yesterday, when folks learned that the manslaughter charge was dismissed, folks who don't follow Black Lives Matter and Hawk Newsome, I urge you to. But Hawk Newsome spoke on behalf of Jordan Neely's uncle. Hawk Newsome is not a member of the Neely family. But if you watch the video on Hawk Newsome's page, you can hear the pain, uh, the collective
Mm,
pain at the judge's decision to dismiss based on the prosecution's request. And I think, it's like being in a domestic violence relationship or being in any toxic relationship, right? Every single day you wake up with the hope that things will be better. Every single day you wake up with the hope that there's healing, there's change coming. And every single day, Black people, oppressed people, are consistently disappointed, and you can hear that um, in the speech that Hawk Newsome gives to the media yesterday.
yeah. Um, I want to talk about race. We put forward a video a couple days ago, just kind of giving a backdrop about this particular case, and some of the commentary that I received in my messages was, "Why am I playing the race card? It doesn't matter. Like, the race shouldn't be playing a role in this conversation." And my question for you, as somebody who has been a career public defender, who is a trained social worker, who is an amazing advocate, why should we not? Why should we not just give up the conversation of race in our criminal legal system, particularly in a moment in our country where people feel as if talking about race is a bad thing?
First of all, the race card is a unicorn. It is a Care Bear. It doesn't exist. This ain't a game. There's no cards to be played. So there is no race card. That white man decided to put that Black man in a chokehold, and that brown man decided to assist him, and that other white tourist decided to assist him. It is always about race, who we are afraid of, right? The color of the individual colors who we are afraid of. The color of the individual colors who we believe. The color of the individual decides what actions we're going to take. It ain't no race card. This is not a game. And it pains me when folks use that phrasing. This is not a joke. This is not a game. People are dying
Right?
because they are perceived threats. This
Yeah,
ain't no joke. There's no race card to be played. Send those folks in your DM to me.
I handled them. Thank you. But I know you got my back, which I appreciate. Um, let's talk
Always.
about mental illness and race. If there would have been, and it's kind of undisputed that Jordan Neely was dealing with mental health issues, that he had a severe cases of schizophrenia. Um, do you think if a white person with schizophrenia had come onto the subway and acted the same way, that he would have been choked out?
I had to take a deep breath before I responded to that. I take the train every single day. And many of the folks that were prospective jurors in the case and are on the jury in the Daniel Penny trial have experienced people that have had mental health crises. None of those people were murdered. None of them. Some of them white, some of them black. There are, if you ride the train every day, you are undoubtedly going to experience someone either trying to entertain you, asking you for money without entertaining you, or experiencing some type of crisis. If we're talking about being unhoused, if we're talking about mental illness, if we're talking about hunger, all of it. If you ride the train every day, folks are experiencing that type of crisis. Jordan Neely having a mental health episode on the train is not an anomaly. People experience that every day, unfortunately. But what the difference is that, when was the last time you heard of a white unhoused person experiencing psychosis being murdered?
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and there are so many issues that are kind of coming into conversation with this case, right? The issue of how are we supporting people who are experiencing houselessness in our communities across the country? How are we supporting people who might have mental health challenges, right, across the country? And how have we lost a care and concern for those people, right? And there's this juxtaposition that the media has been putting forward of Daniel Penny being a military veteran and providing deference and respect to veterans, where the positioning and framing of Jordan Neely as a person experiencing houselessness again suggests this idea that we shouldn't be as concerned about him because of his status and his mental illness. And that was something that continues to bother me, right? We are not just defined by single moments of our lives, right? We all know the framing that Brian Stevenson reminds us of, like we're so much more than the worst thing that we've ever done. But that's not being applied here in this case because we wouldn't describe the worst thing that Jordan Neely has ever done as being houseless or being somebody with a mental illness. These are things that he was legitimately trying to navigate and survive, right? And you mentioned this yesterday. He was an entertainer to survive. This was how he was trying to provide for himself. Now, I want to talk about safety. And we can talk about safety on the subway or safety in New York or safety in our communities much more generally. But how do you think people are getting it right or how do you think people are getting it wrong when it comes to the conversation of safety on subways in this case?
So it's interesting. I feel like, well, the first thing, I just want to take a step back, and you mentioned that, the humanity of Jordan Neely or humanity is being left out of this trial.
Mm,
Humanity is only being left out of this trial in the context of Jordan Neely. Even in the comments under some of your videos, I think someone wrote, "We need more people like Daniel Penny." And the idea that I can either feel or perceive a threat and just decide to murder is wild to me.
yeah.
And we have absolutely lost our humanity 360,
Mm,
or actually 180. 180, we've lost our humanity. The idea that this young man deserved to die because one individual decided that he deserved to die is wild to me. And consistently, whether it be through the media, whether it be during the trial, everyone is talking about the first things that people say after Daniel Penny are retired Marine, right? Student, right? Law-abiding citizen, as if he's not three-dimensional, as if, the decision to take someone's life wasn't wild. And no one is saying, and no one is utilizing that to eclipse everything he's ever done. But they're doing that to Jordan Neely. The fact that he was on that F train experiencing psychosis eclipsed the fact that he was a talented entertainer,
Hmm.
right? Eclipsed the fact that he clearly was not on a medication regimen. Eclipsed the fact that he was unhoused. Eclipsed the fact that he still had people that loved him and he didn't deserve to
Yeah.
die.
And I think people are constantly missing that, and that's what's really frustrating me is that he
Yeah.
did not deserve to die. And when people are saying, well, he was attacking people, my response is, well, where are you getting that from? Because no witness,
Not
um,
one.
no one has said that he was physically attacking somebody. And that's
Not
such
one.
a key fact. Some of
Not
you
one.
know, I teach criminal law at a law school, and we talk about the right to self defense. And there's a concept, there's an element called proportionality. So if somebody is giving verbal threats, you would be justified in giving verbal threats back. And then if somebody is using physical attacks, you could use a proportional physical attack response, but we don't have that here. Jordan Neely experiencing a mental health break and challenges and perhaps yelling at people on the subway is one thing. But to choke somebody out to death is not proportional. And what's really concerning is that there are some people who believe that it is proportional and that what Daniel Penny did is okay. And we just need to have a different conversation about what it is we should be doing when somebody clearly needs help. We should not be choking them out. We should not be assuming and perceiving threats that do not simply exist. And I'm afraid that's what has happened in this case. So let's continue to talk about safety, right? People want to be safe, and being concerned about safety aren't necessarily mutually exclusive things like we were talking about. How should we be reframing who was posing the danger on this subway?
So that's a great question. As New Yorkers, we have to take the train, right? Like, it just is. It is a fact of life if you live in New York City. But one thing I want to head note, I just want to take a step back to the conversation you just had or the statement you just made about proportionality and threats. I also want to note for folks who live in New York and who don't live in New York, this idea of self defense, this idea of justification, right? Now I'm going to put on my lawyer training
Mm-hmm.
hat. In New York, right, you are allowed to defend yourself. Obviously, everyone is. But there is what is called the duty to retreat in New York. Not every state has that. But in New York, before you use deadly force, you are required to retreat if it is safe to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there was not a single passenger that spoke to police or testified in that trial that said Jordan Neely physically attacked them or verbally assaulted them directly. Every
Yeah.
day, I walk into my office like, if y'all mess with me today, I'm gonna kill y'all. I don't think I deserve to die for
Mm.
that, and just fast forwarding to the question that you just asked about safety. Of course everyone deserves to be safe. Like, I often get frustrated when people are like, well, don't people deserve to be safe? What kind of question is that? Of course, who's going to say no?
Right.
Who's going to say no to that question? Not nobody. Of course people deserve to be safe. But that is global, right? I deserve to be safe as a passenger, but I also should be exercising humanity
Mm.
to my fellow passengers. The boy walked onto that train and said that he was thirsty, said that he was hungry. If you didn't have anything to give him, cool. But what he didn't deserve was a chokehold that caused his death.
Yeah. We compared those two actions. A person clearly asking for help, which I would describe as is not opposed to a threat to our safety. And then we have a person who used their hands to choke somebody and kill somebody. And when we're having conversations about safety, people are pointing to Jordan Neely as being the individual who posed some violent threat. And they're not talking about Daniel Penny, who is literally the one who committed the act of violence.
That's what I'm saying. When we ask black people, right? Do you white knuckle it when you see police behind you in vehicles? Do your shoulders hunch up when you walking down the street and you see police officers driving by? Do you white knuckle it when you see a group of older white men? I definitely exit stage left
Mm,
as soon as I see a group of drunk white people.
yeah.
Like when we talk about safety, the idea that that it's linear and that it only looks one way, I think that those are the things that we need to start unpacking, right? Like, of everyone deserves safety. Everyone deserves safety.
Hmm.
Everyone does. And no, and I'm sure, and I want to be clear too, right? The passengers on that train were afraid. The passengers on that train were incredibly scared of Jordan Neely. And many of them describe, the psychosis he was experiencing. They described it as something they had never seen before. And I get that. I get that fear. I can appreciate it. I can respect that. And I've read witness after witness account, of what they saw, but not one of them said that that boy deserved to
Yeah.
die. And in
And
fact, I'm sorry, go ahead, Will.
no, finish your thought. I'll chime in a second.
I was just gonna say, thankfully, there was a young woman and a journalist who I believe recorded the interaction. And, one of the young women, when she was shown the video that she took again, one of the things that she was kind of taken aback by was the fact that there were people in the video. You could hear them saying, "He's not breathing. Let him go," begging for Jordan Neely's life, begging Daniel Penny to spare Jordan Neely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was kind of mentioning this earlier. The role that video recordings are playing in being able to really paint an unbiased and kind of accurate recounting of what took place is it helps us get an actual understanding of what was going on, as opposed to just hearing the um, perceptions of the person who who actually did the killing, and not being able to have the perception of the person who was actually killed. So when
I don't
I
think that matters for us, though. I don't think that matters for us. And it hasn't mattered for us since Rodney King. I don't, it doesn't matter for, and that's the rub, right? And that's, again, it goes back to your conversation about safety, right? And what is this feeling of safety, and what is this perception of safety, right? Because video recordings it hasn't assisted in the accountability of
yeah,
folks.
um, I want to offer two things in response. If we did not have a video of Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck, there would have been a different story told. If we did not have video of Officer Schlegel, who in South Carolina, this was years ago, shoots a man that's running away from him in the back
Hmm.
and approaches the body. I believe his name was Officer Schlegel. I might be misremembering. There was an officer who shoots a black man in the back, then tosses the taser kind of near the black man's
Yep.
body, and
Yep.
that is his report, that he grabbed my taser and so I had to use my gun. But it wasn't until a week or so, later, this video actually emerges to prove that actually is not what happened. And so I just want to lift up a couple of examples. I think I agree with what you're saying, and I think there are times when those videos have demonstrated two things. One, that we do have police officers that lie about their job, and they lie about what has actually taken place. And unless we have a form of accountability to correct and identify those lies, unfortunately, some police officers will continue to lie. I've seen that in my work as a public defender. I'm not saying that all police officers lie, but sometimes they do things that cover up the things that they're actually doing. The second thing is, when we have instances where the only other recounting of that story is a person who is dead, then we actually won't get the full truth. There's this African proverb that says, you know, as long as the hunter tells the story, as long as the hunter, shoot, as long as the hunter tells the story, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will remain the hero. Sorry, I was struggling
Yep.
to get it right. But just to understand that there are times when, you know, passersby or people who are standing by are taking recordings, helps eliminate the ability for law enforcement to lie about what actually took place.
And here, that's true. And here, you know what is wild is Eric Gonzalez, the Latino man who held Jordan Neely's arms down. His instinct was to lie because he knew he fucked up. He knew he messed up the church's money, right? Like his instinct literally was Jordan Neely attacked me. That was his first story. And it was why he didn't want to come in and testify. It was why he fled because he knew he messed up. He knew he messed up. And it wasn't until video surveillance showed that his behind wasn't even on the train when Jordan Neely first got on the train.
Right.
He lit and that's and I think, separate and apart from Daniel Neely, like anti-blackness is so prevalent. Racism, like Hawk Newsom said yesterday, is so prevalent that Latino man didn't even ask a question. Got on that train and held that black boy's arms down. He didn't know what happened. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't know what was going on. And his instinct was this black boy must be a danger.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that brings us to um, so many conversations about how black men and boys are perceived. Um, and I'm thinking about some of the work that the Perception Institute has done that has highlighted the ways in which black men and boys are represented in our media. And I just want to provide three of those findings. It says that black men and boys are overrepresented and praised for their athleticism. And we're talking about representation in the media. So overrepresented and praised for their athleticism, overrepresented and praised for their entertainment value, and then overrepresented and demonized for their criminality. And so if we think about how our brains work, these are supercomputers. Our brains are supercomputers. And we have these things called implicit biases. If our brains have a program of association black men and boys with athleticism, with entertainment, or with criminality, and then I'm somebody who perhaps doesn't regularly interact with black men and boys, and I come across one, my brain is going to say, okay, they're not wearing a jersey, so they're not an athlete. They're not telling jokes as a comedian or holding a guitar as an entertainer, then they're not in entertainment. The default is going to become criminal. And then that association in our brains is going to, manifest itself in how we're actually treating those individuals when we come across them. So there's so many things that we can be unpacking with this case, and I wish we didn't have to do it at the expense of a black man being killed. Right? We need to be having these conversations so much more frequently to try to figure out why it is that we can't go a month in this country without an unarmed black person being killed at the hands of either law enforcement or some vigilante. And I remember particularly in 2020, it seemed like it was every other week we were hearing about a black person having the police called on them because they were sleeping in the Yale library, or because they were barbecuing in Oakland, or because they were in a space that other person didn't believe black people belonged. I want to try and make a slight pivot to back in time to another example of what I would describe as vigilantism in New York on the subway. And many of the folks, watching this might have either lived or have lived or are familiar with the subway in New York. But there was an individual by the name of Bernard Getz who he didn't kill anybody. He shot four young black boys on the subway. And you are very familiar with this case. You have actually watched the confession of Bernard Getz. And I also want us to kind of acknowledge a podcaster who was one of the original ones who made this comparison between Bernard Getz and Daniel Penny. Can you tell us a little bit about what your research has revealed and your own observations comparing the Bernard Getz case and the Daniel Penny trial?
Yeah, so I think, one of the first things that came to mind when I saw that Daniel Penny had murdered Jordan Neely was the Bernard Getz case, right? And this idea of subway vigilantism. And I think it's important to just give this context, right? During the 80s and even currently, right? There's a ton of crimes and things happening on the subways, right? The subways were not safe then, the subways are not safe now. But Bernard Getz had been robbed and pretty severely injured. I believe his right knee was permanently damaged after a robbery. And after he experienced that, he decided never again. He goes and buys an illegal firearm. I think it's important to note that prior to buying that illegal firearm, Bernard Getz had tried multiple times to get a legal firearm but was denied. Um, and so Bernard Getz is riding the two train downtown, and these four young black men get on the train. They were also going downtown, and one of the boys says that only one of them approached Getz. Getz says that two of them approached him. But either way, there was a conversation or request for $5. One of the boys says that they simply asked Mr. Getz for $5. Bernard Getz said that he demanded $5. That's the extent of the
Mm.
conversation. There were no weapons. There were no weapons displayed. There were no threats given. Bernard Getz does not display the illegal firearm to scare them off. He immediately pulls the gun out and starts shooting.
Mm.
Immediately. And again, I think it's important to note that Bernard Getz was not robbed. There was no attempted robbery. He was not threatened. There was no attempted threat. There was a request or demand, no matter how you couch it, for $5. There were no weapons displayed by any of these four black boys. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. But in any event, Bernard Getz pulls out his gun. He shoots two of the black boys in the back
Mm.
and shoots the other two. One of the young men he walks up to when he realizes that he's not as injured as the other three, and he shoots him point blank range, severing his spine, which permanently, which gives him permanent brain damage and also puts him in a wheelchair because he can no longer walk.
Mm.
He's paralyzed from the waist down. Bernard Getz, just like Daniel Penny, was tried in front of a Manhattan jury. The Manhattan jury acquitted Bernard Getz of all charges. One of the things that was noted at the trial was that Bernard Getz, excuse me, he was not acquitted of all charges. My apologies. He was acquitted of all charges relating to the shooting of the four black boys. He was convicted of carrying the illegal firearm.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's important to note, or maybe not important to note, to be honest with you, is that two of the boys had screwdrivers on them. And what was told to the police is that they were simply going to go to the arcade and steal from the arcade. And again, this screwdriver was not displayed to Mr. Getz. He had no idea until he was prosecuted that these boys even had a screwdriver on them. Mr. Getz then flees and he turns himself in. When he turns himself in, and I think that it's another interesting parallel, despite the fact, aside from the fact that they're two white men, another interesting parallel between Bernard Getz and Daniel Penny is how they were treated by police.
Mm-hmm.
When I watch the body worn camera of Daniel Penny, I often think about the body worn camera footage that I watch when I'm reviewing cases of my clients' arrests. And I can tell you, 9 times out of 10, police rush into the scene, throw every black boy they see up against the wall, cuff them, and then start asking questions. When Daniel Penny was approached by police, no one touched him, no one cuffed him. He had a casual conversation with the police about the murder he had just committed,
Mm.
similar to Bernard Getz. Bernard Getz turned himself in and sat incredibly casually, speaking to both police and the prosecutor. And as someone who sat and watched that vile video of Bernard Getz's confession, it was insane to me the amount of racism, sexism, and classism that he spewed, but was still given so much deference and respect by both the prosecutor and the police. Same with Daniel Penny.
Mm.
I have multiple clients that have been arrested for manslaughter. None of them are home. None of them were home for Thanksgiving with their
Yeah.
family.
I appreciate you giving us that breakdown. In the beginning, the connection went out a little bit. Could you remind us the name of the podcaster who was talking about that connection earlier on?
Shoot, I forgot his
Okay.
name, but he deserves,
Well,
it's Eric something. But he deserves all his flowers because he actually, as I was doing the deep dive research, um, for both the Getz case and the Penny case, his podcast came up and I listened to it, and he was one of the first people to make the comparison between Bernard Getz and Daniel Penny. So I did think it was important to give him his flowers. Unfortunately, y'all, I'm sorry, I'm on a cruise and don't have my laptop.
no worries. So a couple comments. My buddy Sam, who lives in Maryland but has lived in New York, was bringing up the
Mm-hmm.
conversation of the demographics of the jury. So in this particular trial, there are 12 jurors, and
Mm-hmm.
we have 7 women. We have 5 men. There are
Mm-hmm.
4 jurors who identify as people of color,
Mm-hmm.
and there is 1 juror identified as a black man. And we think about the
Mm-hmm.
demographics of New York County. I don't have them off the top of my head, but thinking through, is this a jury of Daniel Penny's peers? And I like to say that you and I can be peers in different ways. Now, I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if this is actually a term, but I identify peership in a variety of ways. We can be peers based on gender. We can be peers based on age. We can be peers based on race. We can be peers based on perspectives of the criminal legal system. Right? There's a bunch of different ways in which we can be peers. We can be peers
Right.
based on socioeconomic status, right? Um, do you think, from what you know about this jury, that Daniel Penny has a jury of his peers?
I mean, so it's interesting. I don't know enough about the seated jurors to state that, but they could be, right? They could be. And I it depends, right? And I think that when we think about juries of our peers and we're having this discussion, oftentimes people just think about race, right? And they think an all-white jury would be a jury of Daniel Penny's peers. I know a lot of white people who would not agree with what Daniel Penny did, right? And so I think the idea of jury of our peers is more nuanced and complex than just race. I mean, if he's a conservative black man and looks at, little black boys and others them, then that black man could be a jury of Daniel Penny's peers, right? Right? If those people of color, find themselves white adjacent, believe that little black boys are problematic, then yeah, they could be Daniel Penny's peers if they have the same beliefs,
Mm,
right? If they have the same thoughts and feelings about black boys, um, then they could
yeah,
be, right? They
right.
could be. I think that our faces in these places don't necessarily mean justice or accountability. And I think the conversation has to be um more nuanced than just race. I think we have a comment from Fix. Nola, you are thankful that Daniel Penny did what he did. Nearly sounded threatening and dangerous. People were scared to ride the subway because of people like Neely. So fix Nola. Obviously, you are from or identify as someone who is from New Orleans. And I'm not sure when you joined this live, but I actually stated that. I stated that absolutely. I watched witness accounts and I took it a step further and I read the trial transcripts. It is without question that people were scared. It is without question that people experienced Jordan Neely as someone who was experiencing a psychotic break. That is a fact that is undisputed. um, I I I find it disheartening. I find it sad. I find it troubling. I find it terrifying that you think that he deserved to die. Um, Sounding threatening and dangerous and actually threatening and actually causing harm are two very different things. And it appears based on the comment that you are conflating the two. I was in a bar last night and white people said a ton of things to me that could be considered threatening and dangerous. And by your logic, if I had a gun or if I was a trained Marine in a chokehold, I should be able to put each of those white people in a chokehold because I felt or perceived a threat. Now, I want to be very clear. None of those white people threatened me directly. None of those white people caused me harm directly. But the things that they were generally saying to me were threatening. The things that they were generally saying to me were dangerous. And by your logic, Fix Nola, if I were a trained Marine in the way that Daniel Penny was, I should be able to chokehold each and every one of them. So I just want to caution us on the lack of humanity in our inability to see the humanity in others. But Fix Nola, you may have gone so far left we can't make you right. But thank you for your
I,
comment nonetheless.
I want to add, for people who have the perspective of folks from Fix Nola, is when somebody makes us feel uncomfortable, um, what is the appropriate response, and how does our level of fear dictate that response? That's one conversation. The other conversation is, in the eyes of the law, what is allowed. Um, Verbal threats and kind of uh, making people feel afraid from a legal perspective does not justify the killing of another person. And, Fix Nola, your comment saying, I'm glad Penny did what he did, lands with me as saying, I'm glad Penny killed Jordan Neely. I'm glad Penny choked out somebody experiencing a mental health crisis. And is that the appropriate response for what Neely was doing? And if we think that that is the appropriate response, like Miss Venable was indicating, there could be a lot more violence in America.
There
Um,
will be. There will be a
there,
lot more
there,
violence in
there will
America.
be. And I just want to make sure we are okay. So Fix Nola is saying, and thanks for clarifying. I'm not necessarily glad Penny killed him. I'm just glad he intervened, which I think are two different things, right? Intervention looks like perhaps standing up and maybe saying, Mr. Neely, are you okay? Is there something I can help you with? You said you need food, you need water. Intervention also could look like what he did originally by putting him in a chokehold. But intervention is not holding that man for 5 minutes, removing all of the air from his lungs, right? So I just want to make sure we're being mindful of what we're saying when we say, I'm glad Penny did what he did, but he crossed the line from my perspective by killing Jordan Neely, which I which never should have happened, right?
Right.
So
Because this definitely was not an intervention. It was a murder. It wasn't an intervention. Now, if the conversation is, I wish people intervened more when folks are in crisis or when folks are threatening. I wish that there were more good Samaritans who would step in when there is trouble. Sure, sure. I think, me and you, Fix Nola, could have a beer. I don't drink beer. We could have an old fashioned, right? Like, if that's the conversation. But if you are saying, I am glad that he murdered him, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know how. And when I say the words, I don't know, I'm just saying, I don't know how we get
Yeah.
there. I don't even know how we got here. Well, actually, I
Yeah.
do, but that's a different conversation for a different day.
Yeah. Um, it's really flattering. I have some of my students on the live, and
Hi.
a good number of them just took my criminal law exam on Wednesday. So the fact that they are here, I hope means that the exam wasn't too bad. So Chris has saying, so my point is, what's so different about his case that leads to his death? And I think it's an interesting question because we are not new to the reality that there are people in our country who need mental health services, that there are people who need assistance, that people need to be appropriately housed and have those sources. What's so different about this case that leads to his death is the perceived threat that he was posing to other people, and the idea that Daniel Penny thought the appropriate intervention was to kill him. And I'm
And
saying
he's
to
not
kill.
law enforcement. He's not law enforcement. He's not law enforcement. Many people die every day for having mental illness because they are a perceived threat but at the hands of law enforcement. What Daniel Penny is doing is setting a precedent.
Yeah, Portia, I know you watched the testimony of the military instructor who had
Yeah.
taught Daniel Penny that particular type of chokehold. What
hmm
did that witness have to say about how the chokehold was administered and how that chokehold was intended to be used?
It was brilliant. I, as a criminal defense attorney, will rarely give prosecutors their flowers. Um, but they called the actual instructor that trained Daniel Penny to do the chokehold, and he watched the video and he said that Daniel Penny did not administer the chokehold correctly. And he also stated that he held the chokehold for far too long than was necessary to subdue.
Yeah,
Because if the goal was to subdue, then the length of time was far too long. And I think it's interesting too, right, is that people are also forgetting that that's a key piece in this. For 5 minutes, I would love for our viewers to think about anything that they have to do that is unpleasant for 5 minutes, right? It can feel like a freaking eternity, right? And the idea Neely had his, excuse me, that Daniel Penny had his um forearm on Jordan Neely's windpipe for 5 minutes, crushing it, is wild.
yeah. Yeah, it really is. Thanks for sharing that. Uh, Folks who are on the line, we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes. Put your questions in the chat. If there's something that we haven't addressed yet that you'd be curious to hear about, let us know. If there are things that we've said that you disagree with, let us know. We want to have these conversations because, as was mentioned, there are there were jurors who did not agree on the charge of manslaughter. That is what Daniel Penny was originally charged with. And now the charge
Mhm.
that the jury will be considering is just criminally negligent homicide. They are home for the weekend. They're going to come back on Monday, where they will resume deliberations, and they'll only be addressing the charge of criminally negligent homicide. Um, a couple other comments. Danielle said that they can't watch the microwave for 5 minutes as a reminder of like how long 5 minutes.
Right?
Yeah, Sam, Nigel Noop, Sam is saying, and that's where the accountability should have been. If you're skilled at that, you need to be responsible to know the lethal impact. And what Sam is referencing is like, if you've been trained how to use a chokehold, it
hmm
needs to be administered in the right way. And when you aren't administering in the right way, you have to take some accountability for it. Chris is sharing. I think a big piece is that he is a Marine, and he had to have known his responsive force was excessive. Um, yeah. Let's see. I was curious to know if the jury had to be unanimous, meaning all 12 had to agree, or just a majority was needed. Thanks for that question, Sam.
That's a great question.
Thankfully, all 50 states require unanimous verdicts in criminal trials, so all 12 do have to agree. There was a point in time where Louisiana and Oregon allowed what are called non unanimous verdicts, meaning 10 people could vote guilty, 2 people could vote not guilty, and then the person would be convicted. But that is no longer the case. We do require unanimous verdicts, so all 12 people have to agree. All right. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I especially want to thank Portia for taking a break out of her birthday celebration week. She's literally on the high seas in a cruise, and your internet held up through the whole thing. So I'm excited.
To
That's
the
that's a birthday
Wi-Fi.
gift to us. I really do appreciate you all for joining us for this conversation. If there are questions that come up that you want us to answer, give us send us a message, and we're happy to be responsive as we continue to follow this case. I expect there to be a verdict on Monday because they've already done so much deliberation. The jury has been deliberating since Tuesday, so
Yeah.
by Monday it will almost be a full week. And I don't think that there will be much additional deliberation that they will need to do as it relates to the charge of criminally negligent homicide. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for the disagreement. Thank you for the dialogue. We're so happy to have you here as part of these conversations, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.